Hey guys, it's Divest. So for those of you who don't know, I am a gunsmith. I worked with a lot of different arms manufacturers designing military arms, so I thought I would provide some unique insight into the iconic bolter family of weapons from Warhammer 40k. What Games Workshop got right and wrong about the weapon? The bolter is unique in Warhammer 40k in that it is grounded in real-world technology available to us. In fact, there were automatic magazine-fed rocket guns developed before Warhammer 40k was even a thing, unlike something fantastical like a shuriken thrower or melt-a-gun, or something mundane like an autogun or rocket launcher. A conventional gun uses gas pressure to accelerate a projectile down a barrel by burning a propellant such as gunpowder. This produces extremely hot and energetic expanding gases, which then act on the bullet while they vent out of the barrel. The bolter is different in function as a rocket gun, using a two-stage mechanism where an initial powder charge is used to accelerate the bullet down the barrel, and then kicking on a self-contained rocket charge to accelerate the bullet once the operator is safe from the exhaust. This is the same principle of operation that the famous Soviet RPG-7 operates on, along with most other infantry rocket launchers. In the real world, this is done because it allows for you to bring the recoil down to manageable levels so that infantry can use them. To achieve the same velocity with a RPG-7 warhead using a gun, you would need a gun that literally weighed a metric ton in order to absorb the recoil forces. The trade-off is a rocket is much less efficient at converting chemical energy into kinetic energy than a gun, and because the rocket is integral to the bolt, it serves as dead weight once it runs out of fuel. The original gyrojet failed because the rockets were pathetically weak compared to what a similarly sized firearm could do. My assumption with the science fiction of 40k is that the chemical propellants available to the Imperium are so advanced that the dynamics have changed so that you can achieve higher velocities using a rocket than what is possible with a gun. Despite guns being much more efficient, because of the limits of what is technically and ergonomically feasible with recoil forces. As an example, accelerating a 20mm shell to 1 km a second like the M61 Vulcan does generates somewhere in the realm of 150 kilograms of free recoil, which is why it's not practical for an infantry small arm. The smallest you would ever see is a 40-kilogram plus anti-material rifle that could only be fired prone. But if you had some sort of awesome rocket propellant that allowed you to accelerate a 20mm shell at high velocities outside of the gun, then you could make it into a long arm or handgun for normal humans. And the bolter does exactly that. A .75 caliber bolt pistol light enough to be carried on your hip and easily matches or exceeds the firepower of these rifles that are big enough to make the Barrett .50 cal look like airsoft. And the .998 caliber versions wielded by the Astartes are even more powerful. This wouldn't provide much benefit over a conventional firearm like an M4 carbine in the real world. It might be useful for special applications like blowing doors off their hinges or defeating light or unarmored vehicles. But within the context of the 40,000 universe, it does vastly increase the killing power of their weaponry compared to autoguns in most circumstances. In addition, the bolt is typically an armor-piercing high-explosive round, using a conventional bullet ahead of a small bursting charge with a delay fuse to penetrate the target and then detonate to increase the killing power after penetration. The explosive charge would vastly increase the amount of damage it would do compared to an equivalent solid slug, which would more than likely just blow a hole in the flesh of a target the same size as the slug. That wouldn't be very useful in the real world. But in 40k, that would be a huge boon. You can just look at the enemies the Imperium faces. Orcs, Tyranids, Ogrins, mutants, demons, grotesques, Kroot, and Astartes all are big fleshy targets that can take a lot of punishment, along with machines which would shrug off bullet wounds like combat servitors, Wraithguard, and Necrons. And even against squishy opponents like Guardsmen, Eldar and Tau, their access to science fiction medicine would probably give them much better chances at surviving and recovering from a gunshot injury compared to having a micro-explosive detonate inside of them. So every race in 40k has at least some specialist units where bolters would noticeably improve killing power over an autogun, and a few races have those guys as standard infantry. The multi-stage rocket would put very little force on the gun itself. This means in turn the construction of the bolter could be extremely lightweight compared to conventional firearms, since the forces on the gun would be comparatively insignificant. Despite this, almost all the lore about the bolter indicates it has extremely high recoil. One explanation is that the first stage generates all the recoil. That would be excessive since it would just need to clear the shooter, and if that is the explanation, this would create another flaw in the bolter design, because then the bolter would benefit from having a much longer barrel to make more efficient use of the first stage of acceleration. The bolter typically has a barrel shorter than the receiver, like a SIG-MCX rattler. If the bolter is important for accelerating the bolt, rather than just directing it, then they should have the longest barrel possible. It's not like Space Marines are going to complain about having a full-sized rifle instead of a carbine. As an example, the Brown Bess should be familiar to Brits, and it was 150 centimeters long back at a time where the average adult male height was only 170 centimeters tall. If you scaled that up to a Space Marine, they should be carrying bolters with 2-meter-long barrels on them. Something else to consider is that the rocket on the bolt diminishes its killing power because the rocket takes up volume in the shell that could be used for more explosives, so there are trade-offs to the stopping power using a 2-stage system instead of 1 stage. As a real-life example, the M549 155mm rocket-assisted high-explosive shell uses a rocket to extend the range of the 155mm howitzer. But the M549 only carries 6.8 kilograms of high explosive filler versus 9.1 kilograms of high explosive on the standard M795 high explosive shell, because they had to keep the same dimensions in the shell while adding in a rocket. Another problem with the bolter ammunition construction is that they use diamantine, literally diamond-like penetrators, to tip the shell. Diamonds are hard but brittle, so they would shatter at impact velocities. The diamantine tip would be better suited for a frangible round designed to limit penetration inside of a spaceship. If they wanted a good penetrator, some fictional tungsten or uranium alloy would make more sense. Supposedly, normal humans can't lift Space Marine bolters, and they would kill themselves with the recoil if they fired it. Even though the Space Marine bolters only weigh 18 kilograms, for comparison, the Germans' primary light machine gun during the First World War, the MG-0815, weighed 19 kilograms and the PTRS-41 weighed 21 kilos. If the recoil was enough to kill a mortal, then the tripod-mounted heavy bolter used by the Imperial Guard wouldn't work either. You can shoulder-fire a rifle like the PTRS, but if you tried to mount a KPV machine gun firing the same caliber on a lightweight tripod, it would knock itself over from the sustained recoil of automatic firing unless you braced it with weights like sandbags. The technical demands of automatic reloading and magazine feeding with the bolter could be virtually identical to modern automatic rifles. In fact, Games Workshop made it a bit too similar. Since as a rocket launcher the bolter would be at a disadvantage using a separate casing, it would just create needless complexity, as now you need to account for ejecting the spent casing during the automatic cycling of the bolter, and you have to manufacture another piece to the cartridge. It would make more sense for the bolt to have its first stage contained in the same rocket motor as the main charge, just firing off at different times, to simplify the construction and eliminate the need for an ejection cycle. Also, the longer acceleration phase would help to rein in the recoil even more. You could have the first stage function like the high-low recoil system used by NATO 40mm grenade launchers for that specific reason. Also, the magazine capacity is ludicrous. There's no way to fit 30 25mm rounds into a bolter magazine unless it was longer than the gun itself. But everyone has already acknowledged that fact, and it's even become canon in the game design, with bolters in Darktide maxing out at around 15 rounds with their full-sized double-stack magazines and going down to 7 rounds with the low-profile magazines of the bolt pistol. The recoil also begs the question of why the Imperium even uses bolters over autocannons in the first place. I've been comparing bolters to autoguns using solid shot, but the Imperial Guard can use autocannons on wheeled mounts, and Space Marines can carry them as heavy weapons. These autocannons are modeled off of real-world 20mm designs, so they could use the same warheads as the bolter, and specific models are noted for having a cyclic rate around 500 revolutions per minute. Autocannons have performance characteristics closer in line with higher caliber autocannons compared to the bolter. Something closer to 30 to 40 millimeter shells, they have better penetration, range, and explosive yield than the heavy bolters. So if the Space Marines can effectively wield a full-sized autocannon and fire it unsupported 8 times a second without worrying about the recoil, then they could easily get away with making rifles for the Space Marines that chamber autocannon cartridges and are primarily intended to be fired semi-automatic to increase their killing power. Heavy bolters and bolt pistols would be largely unaffected because you couldn't scale down an autocannon to pistol size since it relies on the barrel length for accelerating the cartridge. And the heavy bolters are noted to have extremely high rates of fire, which makes sense because their cases should be much shorter than conventional cartridges of equivalent payload, so the cyclic action should be much shorter, along with their smaller shells being better suited for suppression and liquidating hordes of smaller enemies. But there would be very little reason for the Space Marines to use bolters as a standard infantry arm, except for some niche like sharing ammunition with the heavy bolter. On the other hand, mortals like Arbites, Sisters of Battle, and Imperial Guard would still have use for long-arm bolters, since they obviously can't fire a rifle chambered in a full cannon cartridge. So the iconic Space Marine weapon is actually poorly optimized for Space Marine usage, but perfect for mortals. Now, with my technical analysis done, I would like to review the bolters I have seen in 40k video games based on how well I think they represent my idea for the design. This is by no means exhaustive because there are a lot of bad 40k games out there not worth playing. First off, I like the Darktide bolter a lot. Despite violating the laws of physics, it functions how they say it operates. It fills a unique niche for the game distinct from an autogun. And I like that it is firing explosive shells with a notable effect, instead of being a regular bullet. Now in reality, a 12-gauge explosive slug is pretty puny. You would use it to blow a door off its hinges or to serve as a precursor to detonate an IED. Obviously it will kill a person too, but so would a solid slug. I think the bolter in Darktide feels more like you're firing a 20mm cannon like what a M61 Vulcan would chamber, which fits my idea for a weapon designed to explode inside its target for maximum damage. Cannons are significantly more effective than machine guns against planes because a bullet will pass right through the plane and make a tiny hole. But even a 20mm shell with less than 10 grams of explosives massively increases the killing power of the shell. Next up, Space Marine 2. The shells ejected out of this sucker are massive, which makes it even more egregious. Also, the heavy bolter overheats, but the gun shouldn't heat up significantly from firing, since the rocket fires outside of the gun. They just sort of operate like generic video game guns, which makes sense for the setting because they have to make the gameplay fit for a Space Marine, and he can't wield an autogun. But it does undercut the mythology of the bolter. The first Dawn of War does the same thing. The bolter fires a continuous stream of regular-looking bullets, although I don't think there are any autoguns to compare it to, like with Dawn of War 2 Chaos Cultists. Dawn of War 2 makes the bolters look low recoil. Even the Imperial Guard heroes wield them casually with one hand. The tracers also indicate its relatively low velocity compared to something like an autocannon though, which has much faster tracers. And I think in Dawn of War 3 they were actually firing caseless ammunition. That's probably an oversight by the developers, but it does conform to my idea of how these guns should operate. Finally, it's time to answer the question, what would I as a firearms expert write if I was making up lore for the bolter? So to summarize how a bolter should actually work: lightweight, light recoil, caseless, very precise, and with firepower equivalent to an autocannon and a stock. And just so that it doesn't seem like I am cheapening the bolter by pointing out its niche being better suited for mortals. There's nothing wrong with the assumption the bolter is an elite weapon compared to autoguns or lasguns left out of reach of most of the Imperium's forces. It could be economics, logistics, a pissed-off machine spirit, the knowledge of how to produce the bolter. A few ideas I have for retcons to 40k to fit my ideas into the existing universe. First off, Space Marine bolters could have some sort of genetic lock built into them that no one in the Imperium can disable. Maybe Chaos could do something with it, but then if you use the bolter, you get mutated. The mechanism would be something that prevents them from being fired by anyone who doesn't have the Astartes gene seed. So once a Space Marine scout starts getting his organs, he can wield them, but everyone else, like Arbits and Sororitas, use bolters derived from a different model, possibly an older one from before the Astartes were created, or one reverse-engineered to the best of the Mechanicus abilities from the Astartes line. And as for my autocannon pill, it doesn't have to contradict the lore or gameplay of 40,000. One idea I have could be that my idea for Space Marine rifle cannons is perfectly sound, but they are only utilized as a specialized weapon like a sniper rifle because the institutional inertia of bolter manufacture prevents them from diverting resources to expanding autocannon production, making the cannon rare. It could also be something explicitly discouraged or banned by the Codex Astartes. Or it could be that Space Marines normally fight humans and orcs who go down in one shot to a bolter or an autocannon. So the extra volume of fire makes the bolter the superior weapon in most real-world scenarios. Like how assault rifles are better than battle rifles as a standard service weapon in most circumstances. An alternative explanation is that my idea for a new class of cannon-caliber rifles could be impossible for the Imperium to implement on scale because of lost technology. A cannon would require alloys and construction capable of withstanding much greater stress than the bolter would, especially if they are having to cut down on the bulk of the design to make it ergonomic enough for the Space Marines to use as a long arm instead of a heavy weapon. They could also have fickle machine spirits, possibly tainted by chaos. That's all I can think about when it comes to the bolter. I hope you had fun listening to this. Let me know if you learned anything in the comment section below. And let me know if you have any other fictional weapons you'd like me to analyze. Until next time, this has been Divest.